Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories.
It was a cold, quiet night in the small industrial town of Willoughby. The clock had just struck midnight when Adam Turner clocked in for his night shift at the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was large and outdated, with creaking walls and flickering lights, but it was reliable work, and Adam didn't mind the isolation. The eerie stillness of the night felt comforting to him, like a break from the chaos of the world during the day. He was alone, or so he thought. His job was simple: monitor the security cameras, check on the building's locks every few hours, and make sure nothing unusual happened. It was the same routine night after night. But tonight something felt off. The lights flickered a bit more than usual, casting long, haunting shadows down the narrow hallways. Adam shrugged it off, just another quirk of the old warehouse. He sipped his coffee and settled into his chair, keeping an eye on the security monitors. Around 1:30 a.m. he noticed something strange on one of the cameras. A figure, a shadow, was moving slowly down one of the corridors, near the storage area. Adam frowned. The building was supposed to be empty aside from him. His first instinct was to assume it was just a glitch, a distortion on the camera. But the movement on the screen didn't match any of the usual patterns. It was deliberate. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the storage area, checking each room along the way. There was no one there. He sighed in relief but couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. Returning to his post, he glanced back at the camera monitor. The shadow was gone. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that things began to escalate. The same shadow appeared on the monitor, but this time it was closer to the entrance. Adam's heart raced as he checked the back door to make sure it was locked. It was. So how was this figure moving so freely? He walked cautiously toward the main hallway, his footsteps echoing through the empty building. The air felt colder now, and the usual hum of the old warehouse seemed eerily quiet. As he turned the corner, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He could feel someone or something watching him. He shone his flashlight around, but the hallway was empty. The building creaked in the silence. Adam's instincts told him to leave, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had a job to do and he didn't want to seem paranoid. When he returned to his security desk, there was a soft knock at the window. Adam froze. He knew there was no one else on the premises. He slowly turned to face the door, but no one was there. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. Suddenly, the monitors began to flicker violently. Adam scrambled to stabilize the screens, but the images were distorted. Then, on the central monitor, he saw it, the figure standing right in front of the security desk, staring directly at him. But there was no one in the hallway. No one in the building. Panicked, Adam jumped from his seat and rushed to the front door. It was locked, just as he had left it. But as he turned around to head back to the control room, the figure appeared again, this time directly in front of him. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it had shape, features, but no face. Adam's heart pounded in his chest as the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The figure moved closer, and he could hear the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. Hours passed. The cold, eerie silence had taken over. Adam hadn't heard anything since, but he could still feel the presence, lurking just beyond the walls. When the morning shift arrived, they found Adam's body slumped in the security chair, his eyes wide open, frozen in terror. There was no sign of a struggle, no trace of anyone entering the building. But the security footage revealed something unsettling. The cameras had been off from 2 a.m. until 4 a.m. The only thing left on the monitors was a strange static, and in the midst of it, the shadowy figure. Some say it was just a malfunction, that Adam had simply let his imagination run wild in the isolation of the night shift. But others still swear that something in that warehouse, something ancient and dark, was watching, waiting, and had claimed its victim on that cold, silent night. And every so often, the building's lights flicker, and the shadow can be seen once more moving through the halls, waiting for the next night shift to begin. The morning after Adam's disappearance, the police launched an investigation. They scoured the building, speaking to workers who had been there during the day, but no one could provide any answers. The security footage was mysteriously corrupted, and the only thing that remained was the unsettling static, along with a shadowy figure faintly visible in the distorted images. As days passed, whispers spread throughout the small town of Willoughby. Employees of the warehouse spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences, things they had witnessed over the years, small, seemingly insignificant events that no one had paid much attention to. But now, with Adam's death, the stories were given weight. One of the workers, a man named Tom, had been there for years. He'd always kept to himself, never talking much about the history of the building. But now, after hearing about Adam's terrifying final moments, he began to open up. "I've seen it too," Tom said, his voice low and steady as he spoke to a few trusted colleagues. "That shadow. It's not new. It's always been there, lurking, waiting. It's part of the building, part of the night. It comes out when it knows you're alone." Tom's words were met with skepticism at first, but the more they discussed, the more others started to remember similar incidents. The strange noises late at night, the flickering lights, the cold spots. Some even mentioned hearing footsteps when no one else was around. But there was something deeper. Something the workers had avoided talking about for years. The building, they said, had a dark history. It had once been a factory decades ago, but no one could remember exactly when it was closed down. There were rumors about workers who had disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found. And the night shift, particularly, was always said to be the most cursed. A few weeks after Adam's death, another employee, Claire, took over his position. She had been hesitant at first, no one blamed her for being afraid, but she needed the job. Her first night was uneventful, but as the hours ticked by, she started to notice the oddities. At first it was subtle. The cold drafts in the hallways. The strange flickers of light from the cameras. Then, around midnight, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the building. She froze. No one was supposed to be here. She stood up and grabbed the flashlight, but when she checked the hallways there was nothing. Still, something felt wrong. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Claire walked the corridors, checking doors and windows, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But as she turned a corner, the unmistakable shape of a figure appeared in the distance, standing still in the shadow of the flickering lights. It wasn't just a shadow this time. It had a form, a presence, dark, looming, and silent. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She called out, but there was no response, only the echo of her own voice. "Hello?" she asked, her voice trembling, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, still as stone. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the building and never look back, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. Slowly, with every step, it seemed to grow closer, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Claire backed away, her hand trembling as she reached for her walkie-talkie to call for help. But just as she was about to speak, the figure vanished into the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was it a trick of the mind? Had she imagined it? But as she returned to the security desk, the cameras flickered, showing the same distorted static as Adam's last night. She couldn't explain it. She wasn't sure what was happening in the building, but she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The following night, Claire returned, determined to face whatever haunted the warehouse. But this time she came prepared. She brought a friend with her, a fellow employee named Mark, who had been working in the building for years and had heard the same stories. Together they started their shift, checking the cameras and walking the halls. As the clock struck 2 a.m., they noticed something new on the footage. The same shadowy figure, only this time it was following them. It wasn't just appearing and disappearing on the monitors. It was moving through the building in real time. Claire's pulse quickened as they checked the rooms, but no one was there. Then, in a horrifying moment of realization, Mark looked at the security camera feed, his face pale with fear. "Claire, it's following us." The figure on the screen was no longer in one place. It was tracking their movements, mimicking them as they walked through the hallways. It was getting closer. With a jolt, Claire realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was something else, something that had been in the building for far longer than anyone knew. Something that had waited for years, watching those who worked the night shift, always waiting for its next victim. Just before they could react, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, filled the air. Claire's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke to Mark. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could reach the exit, the figure appeared in front of them, blocking their way. It was tall, its form distorted in the darkness, and its eyes. There were no eyes. Just darkness staring back at them. The last thing Claire remembered was the cold, suffocating air as the figure moved toward them, and then everything went black. When the morning shift arrived, they found the security room empty. The monitors showed nothing but static. No sign of Claire or Mark. The only thing that remained was the faint echo of footsteps, slowly fading away into the silence of the abandoned warehouse. And as the building stood there, dark and still, the shadow waited. Always waiting for the next night shift to begin. It had been a week since Claire and Mark disappeared, and the warehouse remained eerily silent. The rumors around town grew more persistent. Some believed the building had been cursed long before it was abandoned, its dark history stretching back further than anyone cared to admit. But still, no one had dared to go inside since Claire and Mark vanished. The local authorities were at a loss. Despite numerous searches, they had found nothing, no sign of struggle, no traces of the missing employees. The only thing that lingered was an unexplainable dread that hung over the town. A few weeks later, the warehouse was scheduled for demolition. The owners, eager to wash their hands of the place, wanted to make room for new development. But when the workers arrived to begin their job, they hesitated. They had heard the stories, the tales of shadows and things that lurked in the dark, but they figured they could just bulldoze the old building and be done with it. They had no idea what they were about to uncover. The first day of demolition went smoothly, with crews breaking apart the exterior walls and clearing out the rubble. But as the work progressed, they began to hear strange noises, creaking sounds from within the building, like the walls themselves were groaning in protest. The temperature dropped sharply as if a sudden winter had set in. At first, the workers dismissed it as the inevitable consequences of working in an old, decaying building. But then things started to get strange. One worker, Dan, was the first to see it. He was operating the bulldozer, clearing debris from one of the side entrances. He paused for a moment, his attention drawn to a figure standing in the shadows just beyond the building's broken windows. He blinked, certain he had just seen someone move. But when he checked again, the figure was gone. His heart pounded, but he told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Later that afternoon, the crew took a break, gathered in the van parked outside. But as they sat there, they heard something. Faint whispers like voices from the walls themselves. They couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, menacing, and full of malice. Then the air grew heavier, colder. One of the workers, Mike, pulled out a cigarette and lit it, but when he exhaled, the smoke hung in the air unnaturally, swirling in patterns that didn't match the draft. "Did you guys see that?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. It looked like shadows moving. Right in the doorway. The others looked at him, eyes wide with fear. They were all beginning to feel it, the growing unease that something was wrong. Something had been awakened in that building and they didn't know how to stop it. As they made their way back to the site, the temperature dropped even further, and the wind howled through the cracked windows. Then the lights flickered, one by one, and the buzzing sound of the electricity failing filled the air. The crew stopped in their tracks as they noticed something else, a shadow moving just beyond the cracked walls, too large to be cast by the dim lights. One of the workers, Paul, swallowed hard. "It's back," he whispered, barely audible. The figure in the shadows wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. It was standing there, watching them, its form tall and twisted, just beyond the reach of the flickering lamps. Its face was hidden, but its presence was undeniable. As the men backed away in terror, they realized the shadow was following them. No matter which direction they moved in, it seemed to be right behind them, moving silently through the darkness. Mike, still clutching his cigarette, looked over his shoulder and froze. The shadow had shifted, now standing directly behind them. "We need to leave. Right now," Paul ordered, his voice cracking. But the air grew thick with an almost suffocating weight, and the whispers returned louder now as though they were being drawn closer. The crew bolted, running toward their trucks in a panic. But as they reached the vehicles, the ground seemed to shift beneath them, and the shadow loomed larger, its outline stretching unnaturally as it moved toward them. The workers scrambled into the trucks, desperate to escape, but no matter how fast they drove, the shadow followed them, its presence hovering in their rearview mirrors, fading only as they left the town limits. By the time the morning sun began to rise, the workers had abandoned the demolition project. The shadow had vanished, but the terror it left behind lingered. The building, now left untouched and half demolished, still stood in the distance, silent and ominous. No one had the courage to return. The whispers, the shadows, the cold that never seemed to leave, it all remained in the air, like a curse that had seeped into the very foundation of the place. A few weeks passed and then a new group of workers was hired. They were determined to finish what had been started, convinced that the previous crew had simply been overreacting to nothing. But by the time they arrived at the site, the air was already thick with unease. The lights flickered once more, the temperature plummeted. And as the workers made their way inside, a faint whisper echoed through the walls. They couldn't hear the words, but the feeling was unmistakable. The shadow was waiting for them. The new group of workers hesitated at the edge of the warehouse, the heavy air pressing down on them. But they pushed forward, determined to finish the demolition, dismissing the stories they had heard from the previous crew. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the abandoned structure, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. As they entered the building, the temperature dropped sharply. A low, unsettling hum filled the air, almost like a distant whisper, but when they stopped to listen, it stopped. Each worker felt the weight of something watching them, but they tried to shake it off as nerves. They started their equipment, but just as they began to tear down more walls, the power flickered, plunging the building into darkness. The whirring of machinery ceased, and the silence was deafening. It was then that they heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing through the empty halls, too heavy to be just the wind. The men stood still, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound grew closer, footsteps moving in their direction, but no one appeared. Then the shadows began to shift, stretching unnaturally as though alive, creeping along the walls toward them. The temperature continued to drop, and the air grew thick with dread. One of the workers, Jerry, was the first to break. He bolted toward the exit, shouting to the others to follow him. But as he reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the building. The lights flickered again and the shadows converged on them. A cold, whispering voice seemed to rise from the very walls, words that couldn't be understood but that felt like they were sinking into their minds, chilling their souls. The figure emerged from the darkness, tall and twisted, its face a void of shadow. It had no eyes, only darkness that stared back at them. Its presence was overpowering, suffocating. The workers froze, unable to move as it approached. The whispers grew louder, more intense, until they were all-consuming, filling every corner of their minds. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, the workers lunged at the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The shadow closed in on them, its form engulfing the room, swallowing the light and the sound. And then everything went black. When the morning shift arrived, they found the building empty, just as it had been before. The wreckage from the demolition was still there, but no workers, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had vanished, swallowed by the very darkness that had claimed Adam, Claire, Mark, and countless others before them. The warehouse stood, silent and abandoned once more. The shadows, the whispers, the cold, they remained, waiting for the next night shift to begin, for the next group of souls to cross into its grasp. Some say the building is cursed, others believe it's something more. But one thing is certain. Whatever waits inside that warehouse is not just a shadow. It's a presence, and it's always watching. As the years passed, the town of Willoughby slowly moved on, but the whispers remained. If you're ever near the old warehouse at night, you might still hear the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear the voice, calling you to join the others who never left. Because once you step inside, you're never really alone.